Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be making some more progress on the LS swap in the 98 Jeep Cherokee XJ. I showed you getting the motor in place last time, and since then I have moved it just a little bit. I repositioned it a little further forward to the front just because it was kind of tight on the back corners of the cylinder head right near the firewall. And these Novak conversion mounts, they have 3 different holes in them, and now I'm just in the frontmost position, which only moved it by probably ½ an inch or so, but it was just enough to give me a little bit extra clearance to where I was happy with it on the back of the firewall, and I threw the radiator in just kind of for mock-up purposes. And yeah, it's a tight fit, but I think we're in the clear. The biggest challenge is really just going to be the upper radiator hose, but I think if I use like an LS3 Camaro upper hose that has that tight 90 on it, I think we'll be good to go there. Other thing that I noticed, we've got this LS Simple accessory drive. And this accessory drive isn't necessarily specific for swapping into an XJ. It's just sort of a universal aftermarket part. And it fits great around the chassis and everything. It'll clear the hood just fine. But the stock Jeep battery sits right here, and we're not going to be able to run the battery right there. So I talked to the owner. We had a couple different options, and we elected to just relocate the battery to the back, somewhere in the passenger compartment or something. Maybe we'll have to get like an Optima dry cell. But yeah, the battery tray on these XJs, it kind of sits at an angle, and it's about like here is where the edge of the battery would be. So definitely interferes with the AC compressor. And even if we wanted to move it to this side, it's a little bit more room, but it still would hit the alternator. So we're just going to have to do a remote battery mount. Other than that, I haven't done a whole lot on the Jeep. The main objective for today is to get the transfer case underneath, because right now I still have my trans jack just holding up the transmission. That's a 4L60 in there, you'll remember. So to get the transfer case mount built, obviously I first have to have the transfer case in place. And to do that, we got to do a little bit of work. Now, the owner of the Jeep decided that we're going to be reusing the original transfer case to the Jeep. This is an NP231, and part of the reason is because we already have a slip yoke eliminator installed on the back here, and it's a fairly strong case, and kind of his thinking was, you know what, this will be like the fusible link. So we've got everything else in the drivetrain that's pretty strong, and if something's going to break, well, it'll just be this transfer case because it's, you can kind of think of it as a disposable item. Now, to get it to work with a 4L60, I do have to swap over the input shaft, this guy right here, which is a pretty simple job, and I'll show you that just in a second. But first, I kind of wanted to nerd out for a second and share some cool information that I learned probably a year ago about transfer cases and what the numbers mean. And this applies to new venture and new process transfer cases. So it all has to do with the numbering. The first number, this is NP231. 2 simply means it's a 2-speed or 2-range transfer case. There's a high range and there's a low range. The second number in new process and new venture gearboxes, or sorry, transfer cases, is just a representation of how strong it is. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll hold a certain amount of torque in terms of foot-pounds, but it's just a relative scale. So 1 being the least and 9 being the most. This is an NP231, so it has a strength rating of 3. And finally, the final number, this is a 1. There was 1, 3, 6s, 9s, and there's probably a few others in there. 1 means it's a mechanically floor-shifted transfer case. So let's say you have an NP261 that would have been found in like a 2500 HD. Well, that's a 2-speed case, has a strength rating of 6, and has 1, meaning it's mechanically floor shifted. They had NP263s, NP243s. Those are a 2-range transfer case that have a little bit stronger rating, but they're shifted with a button. Now, finally, the last number is they have 6s, like my Suburban originally had an NP246. That is an Dynatrac transfer case, which actually uses a automatic transmission style clutch pack to engage power to the front end, and they'll automatically engage if it senses slip. And then finally, there's a 9, like the NV149. That's a 1-speed transfer case, 4 strength rating. And finally, the 9, that means it's a viscous coupled all-wheel drive transfer case. So anyway, that's just something kind of cool about the way that they numbered those. It's really not that important, but I thought it was kind of fun to share. So anyway, we've got ourselves an NP231, 2-speed mechanically floor shifted strength rating of 3 that we're going to be adapting to the 4L60. Now, I'm pretty sure they used a variant of the NP231 in like S10 Blazers and stuff like that, which I suppose if you had one of those, it might drop right in with no conversion needed. But to get this Jeep NP231 bolted up to the 4L60, like I just mentioned, we are going to have to swap over the input shaft. Now, this is something else I didn't realize. I kind of assumed that the Jeep input shaft would be a little bit smaller than the 4L60, but I took a measurement. The 4L60 uses a 27 spline output shaft that mates to this input shaft here. And the measurement from the widest part of the spline is like 1/200, where the measurement on this NP231 from the Jeep is like 1/250. So it's like 50 thousandths of an inch larger on the Jeep. So we are going with a slightly smaller shaft, but kind of the owner's logic here is just let's make this the fusible link, let's make this the weak link, and they're probably not that expensive to get another one, let's say if something did go wrong. So the first thing we're gonna do is just completely disassemble this transfer case, and then we can swap out the input. Okay, so we more or less have to disassemble the entire transfer case to get this input shaft swapped over. It basically sits here, and looking from the back, it is the furthest ahead part of the transfer case. Unfortunately, you can't just pop it out of this side and put the new one in. So that means start from the back. The first thing we're gonna do is take off this output yoke, and then we'll get off this slip yoke eliminator kit, then we'll take the two halves of the case apart. So after we get the rear housing off, the next thing we're going to take off is this little speedometer drive gear. And a lot of stuff inside these transfer cases is held together with these little spring style of snap rings. All I actually have right now are these traditional snap ring pliers that have the little round spots on the end, but that should be just enough to kind of spread these snap rings apart and we get all the gears and stuff off. All right, so far taking this apart is fairly straightforward. Obviously, once you get the slip yoke eliminator housing off the back, there's a couple of snap rings. That'll allow the oil pump in the back half just to kind of slide up over the back of this output shaft. From there, one of the most important things to remember as you are going to be putting this back together is this guy right here, the oil pump pickup tube. This kind of sits right down here at the bottom of the case. There's a little tiny O-ring and this engages into the oil pump. Now, if this does not get hooked up properly, you're going to burn this transfer case up because it actually provides pressurized lubrication to all the bearings that are on the top side of this, which actually sit above the level of the fluid. So anyway, you have to break the seal that holds the two halves of the case together. That's kind of held together usually with glue. There's a little corner here where there's like a little machined indentation that'll actually allow you to get like a small tapered chisel or something in there. Just be cautious where you're prying from because you can damage a case if you're not careful. But once you get the glue broken apart, this thing will basically just lift right apart. And then you take the guts out and then we'll get a little bit closer to the input shaft. So to get the main guts out of the transfer case, you're going to have to remove the front output shaft. So there's just a nut and a yoke on the front side. You take those off, and then you can grab the chain, the front output, and the rear output assembly, just kind of all in one big chunk and slide it out. Also, don't forget the shift fork in there. There's a couple of shift pads. You want to make sure you grab all that stuff and that it doesn't fall down inside the case. So now, all we got to deal with is a low-range planetary. We'll get that out of the way, and then finally we get access to the input shaft that we're after. The input shaft is loaded up into the planetary. We've got a new seal driven into the bearing retainer. The case halves are cleaned up, and we're more or less ready to start putting this transfer case back together. Just wanted to give you a couple of quick notes of things to look out for if you're going to tackle something like this on your own. Number one, when they ship these input shafts or a lot of different type of transmission shafts, they'll coat it with this like really waxy rust preventative stuff, which is great because you don't want any rust to form on a shaft like that, but it can plug up some of the oiling holes, and this one actually both oiling holes were like filled up. Now this is the old input shaft right here, and I'll just kind of show you. I just took a small piece of wire like this, just kind of went along in here, just kind of dug out all the old oil or not oil, but the rust preventative stuff. So there's one hole there, and there's one on the other side down here. Like I said, just want to make sure you get that kind of worked out. And then just take some brake clean and make sure all the old waxy paste is off. Again, that's the old input shaft, that's the new one. But that'll just prevent your oil from getting where it wants to go. They provide a new seal for the bearing retainer. That was a simple push in, push out. A lot of brake cleaner on this case. It looks like it was dunked at the bottom of a river or on the beach or something like that. So make sure you clean it up. Also, oil pump. I've ordered another one because this one has seen better days. There's two problems with it. Number one, this spot right here, this is where the pickup tube kind of engages into the oil pump. It's all broken off. And number two, the seal right here that actually holds the oil pressure and helps guide it into the shaft where it belongs. Well, this seal is like half missing in here, and I don't know if I can actually get a good focus on it in there, but it's half gone, so that's going to prevent oil from actually getting where it needs to go. So I've got another oil pump on the way that'll take care of both of those problems. Other than that, everything's cleaned up, pretty much good to go. This transfer case stuff is really simple. It's just basically snap rings that kind of hold everything together. You just got to know which snap rings to take off where. So hopefully I can get most of this together without having that oil pump right now. If not, I'll just have to pull it back out. So I'll just kind of examine that as I put it back together and see what I can do. But at least if I get the transfer case back under the truck or most of it, I can take care of the oil pump later on, and I can at least work on getting the mount installed where it needs to be. So I've got the transfer case pretty much put back together. I decided against sealing the back halves of the case together right now, simply because I am going to be getting an oil pump in another day or two. And it's going to be a lot easier just to take the two halves apart, take the back off the transfer case and put the oil pump on with the back of the case rather than trying to slide it over the output shaft and get the little oil pump pickup to kind of engage where it's supposed to be. So I'll just temporarily bolt it under the truck for now just to make sure everything lines up and the mount's in place. But I did a little bit of messing around off camera just to kind of get the rest of the adapters set up, kind of figured out. I had to replace the bottom 4 studs with these longer studs that are provided with the kit. These use a coarse thread nut instead of a fine thread nut like this one here. And the reason for the longer studs is because they have this little mount here that kind of slides over the bottom couple of studs just like that. I also messed around with the adapter spacer. This part right here bolts onto the back of the transmission. I slid on the little reluctor wheel that goes onto the output shaft. I made sure it engages in the right spot with the speed sensor so it'll give the pulse signal to the computer to let it know how fast it's going. This is actually 2 separate halves. I bolted these 2 halves together. I'm going to bolt this part to the transmission, and then finally when I put the transfer case under the truck, this is the one connection that you're going to make or break. This little adapter piece here, it does have provisions for a normal mount, but this is what's supplied, so this is what we're going to use. It does look like it might be a little bit kind of a pain in the butt to put on here, but I think it'll be not too bad. So now I'll get this adapter plate bolted up onto the transmission. I've got a gasket I had to buy for this side of it, one of those square O-rings. And then once that is bolted to the transmission, then we can put the transfer case back under the truck. I've got the transfer case mounted in its final position, but unfortunately it is temporary for the moment, simply because number 1, the oil pump issue that I had mentioned just a little while ago, and number 2, the seal I ordered for the extension housing where it bolts onto the 4L60, it's like way too big. This I think is a front pump seal. On the website it did say this was an extension housing seal, but clearly it is way too big. So I've got another one of those on the way, and I think the oil pump will be here tomorrow. I'm definitely not going to include it in this upload. I may show it in the next one, not sure. But as totally simple stuff just to swap back out, and I already showed you the whole process of taking the transfer case apart and putting it back together. So now I'm going to move on and just get the mount done, which will finalize the position of this drivetrain in the XJ Cherokee. So the tail housing mount that you saw was an advanced adapters part, and the other half of the mount kind of looks like this. It's just a horseshoe shape with a through bolt, and that goes through the urethane bushing that they have on the mount. So unfortunately this isn't going to work, and it's probably no surprise because it's more or less just a universal product, I guess. Basically it's just way too short. It needs to be probably 3 or 4 inches tall. Fortunately rather, I do have these tabs here. These are from Rough Stuff Specialties, and I did buy these actually to be shock mounts on the Dana 70 that I'm putting in the Suburban, which is going to be a project that happens a little while later on. But anyway, I'll just order another set because this is perfect for the transmission mount. So all I'm going to do is basically just cut these vertical ears off. I'll just basically replace them with this. I'll come in here and cut a straight line because they're a little bit too tall right now. So I'll cut that off, weld them on there. It's the perfect through bolt size already. And then the last thing I'm going to have to do is just on the bottom, there's 2 mount holes that are tapped into this bracket. Again, this is kind of universal, so that's not the correct spacing for the Jeep. This is what the Jeep mount looks like. And as you can see, the spacing is just a little bit off, but not a huge deal. All I'll do is just come in here, put 2 new holes right in the center of that guy, and I'll have it bolted right down. So let's get to work. It's always a really major milestone whenever you get the drivetrain in its final position, you take out the jacks, and the weight is entirely on the suspension, and basically everything is permanent. Now, this isn't exactly permanent because, yeah, the transfer case will have to come back out. I'll put the oil pump in and seal the two halves of the case together, but that's totally not a huge deal. It's just simple R&R work. All the mock-up and fabrication for the drivetrain mounting, it's done, and everything seems to clear really well for the most part. There are a few exceptions and a few measurements that I did take after I took the jack out. Number one, the big thing that we're gonna have to deal with is the front drive line. It's now too long. The straight six engine does sit quite a bit further back in the engine bay, or the bell housing does, compared to where the 5.3 is at. And you can see this really big empty space right back there, that kind of detent in the firewall. Well, the straight six bell housing was probably, I'd say, 2 to 3 inches further back than the 5.3, than the 6.0. So the 6.0, 4L60, and 231 combo, it sits a little bit farther forward. So we'll have to get a new shorter front drive line. The rear drive line I didn't measure yet, but there is a pretty long slip yoke in there, or a slip joint in there. So maybe we can stretch it just enough to at least, you know, start the thing up, drive it around town, drive it onto a trailer or something like that. And then the owner can measure and get new drive shafts whenever he's ready to do so. One other thing I did check, the throttle body actually is going to hit the hood, not by much, by just a little bit. And obviously we're going to have to take care of that. There's two spots. Number one, this is a little air vent right here. I think we can just kind of rotate that back and down so it kind of points in this direction right between the little throttle arm. So we'll take care of that. And then it's going to hit with this little top spot right here. It just barely interferes with this corner of the brace, kind of right through there. I will have to cut away just enough. I don't have to cut away the outer surface of the hood, but I mean, that engine, don't forget, it's going to kind of rock and roll back and forth a little bit. So you want to make sure it doesn't hit, it doesn't rub, and you want to be able to shut the hood, obviously. So that's one thing to take care of. I did sort of check. There's really no way to lower the engine down. It would be nice if I could drop the whole thing just a little bit, but that's all right. We'll figure it out. I put the headers on. The headers are going to clear just fine. It is going to be a little bit tricky to get the exhaust on the driver's side, just because we're going to have to kind of snake in between the drive line and the oil filter, and then get the exhaust to go underneath the bell housing and pass across where it's going to meet up with the Y pipe and catalytic converter. Also, where was I going with this? I forget. Beyond this, we're actually getting really close to firing this thing up. There's, I mean, a few odds and ends, but you know, we've got to install the wiring harness. We can install the transcooler lines, the fuel pump and the fuel system, build the exhaust. So we're a little ways away, but I mean, we got the whole drivetrain in. That's a major milestone. So like I said, I'm really happy. Now, a couple things I want you guys to do to help me out. Number one, head on over to tolmanperformance.com. We got all kinds of merch over there, t-shirts, hats, hoodies, and stuff like that. Right now, I'm wearing one of my new favorite designs. We call this one Treadless Trucking. This is actually the wheel and tire that is on the AT4, and we kind of animated it to do a burnout. Treadless Trucking, that's a cool little slogan. So head on over there, grab one of these shirts. Don't forget a hat to cover up your bald spot. Not that, again, I don't know anything about that, but you need one. Hoodie, whatever you want. Also, what really helps this channel grow is click the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment down below. All those things really help the algorithm, and I appreciate your guys' feedback. So, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in a couple days for the next upload.